the English Electric Lightning, an aircraft whose very name evokes a fighting machine of awesome speed and power. This aircraft was to prove itself a true thoroughbred, following on from other great British fighters like the Spitfire, Hurricane and the Hunter. The Lightning story spans 4 decades, and it was the product of a small dedicated design and production team that had spent many of the war years making Handley Page Halifax bombers under license. This same team went on to produce the hugely successful Canberra bomber. The development of the Lightning goes back to just after World War II, when English Electric's chief engineer, Teddy Petter, made a few basic sketches of an aircraft that would be capable of breaking the sound barrier in level flight. His ideas were unconventional, to say the least. It was to have a 60-degree sweep-back wing, an all-moving tailplane, 2 engines, one mounted on top of the other, in a slab-sided fuselage with the pilot sitting on top of the lot. What English Electric were proposing was such a massive leap in fighter design and technology that their ideas were met with some skepticism by the Ministry of Supply. The Ministry finally yielded to English Electric's lobbying and found itself issuing Experimental Requirement 103, which called for a manned research aircraft capable of 1.5 times the speed of sound and heights of 30,000 feet. The requirement for this state-of-the-art supersonic aircraft was issued by the Ministry in 1947. Remarkable in that only 7 years earlier, the Gloucester Gladiator, a biplane with a top speed of 235 miles an hour, had been in frontline service with the Royal Air Force. The Lightning entered service in 1960 and became the mainstay of Britain's air defence for a record 28 years, during which time its performance and superb handling qualities earned it the respect and affection of a whole generation of fighter pilots. The Lightning represented the very pinnacle of British fighter aircraft design and production. It was the very first supersonic aircraft to be wholly designed and built in Britain. And in today's world, where fighter aircraft development costs are so huge that they have to be shared amongst many countries, the Lightning is likely to remain the very last British fighter. One of the few men involved in the Lightning project from the earliest days was Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, or B to close friends and colleagues. B had been employed by English Electric as chief test pilot for the Canberra project and was the natural choice to head the new fighter test program. He recalls how the Canberra played a part in the origins of the Lightning.
English Electric were tasked at the end of the war with taking on the design of the first British jet bomber, an aeroplane that was going to double the performance of existing bombers in the service. And this was all started up at Preston under the leadership of Teddy Petter, who was the chief engineer. And after about 2 years of design work, the project was coming along very well. It occurred to Teddy Petter and his team that the performance of this new jet bomber was going to be so great that it was going to need a supersonic aeroplane to intercept it. Now, at that time, there was no apparent supersonic fighter under development anywhere in the world. And Teddy Petter said, OK, to his team, we'll scheme one. Over a period of about 18 months, they worked on this in the late 40s, presented a proposal to the Air Ministry, and by 1949 this came back as a development contract on English Electric for the F-2349, which was to be a supersonic research aeroplane with development potential into a true fighter.
One other member of the young, dedicated design team was destined to play a leading role throughout the lifetime of the Lightning project. Freddie Page suddenly found himself head of the design team when Teddy Petter decided to leave English Electric.
Teddy Petter effectively retired from the Wharton design team at the end of 1949, and I was then his deputy and took over from him when we had just flown 4 prototype B1 Canberras. The B1 Canberra, of course, never went into production. The first production Canberra was the B2. It was a jolly good, small team that Teddy Petter had built up. And it was a great privilege to work with them, and I hope for them. At that time, I was 32, and Teddy formally left the English Electric organisation, and I was engaged as chief engineer just about the time of my 33rd birthday. It was a marvellous challenge for a young chap.
It was a period of enormous inspiration, really. I mean, we were involved, as you know, at English Electric with the fairly big, for those days, flight test program on the Canberra jet bomber. And in parallel, we were developing the P1, which was to be the first British supersonic aeroplane. Initially, this was designed to be fully controllable at just a little over the speed of sound. Well, in the evolution of this design stage of this aeroplane, it became quite apparent with the amount of power that was going to be eventually available to us with the new Rolls-Royce Avon RA24 engines. This new design would actually be capable of achieving not just the speed of sound, but more than twice the speed of sound. And this was all coming to us in the immediate future, so it was a very exciting time.
This was what they produced, the P1 prototype. On the 4th of August 1954, the P1 made its first flight. Just 7 days later, B and the P1 made history.
On the next flight, we had a nice clear day. We climbed up over Swanage, turned east up the channel, set the throttles at full power and a slightly higher altitude this time. And after about 3.5 minutes, we came up against this 0.98 hesitation, held it there for a little longer, and all of a sudden the Mach meter, without any vibration or change in trim of the airplane, the Mach meter jumped to a little bit beyond Mach 1 and we were supersonic. And no drama, nothing at all. Britain had a supersonic airplane.
The P1 was an outstanding success. However, the original order also called for 3 operational prototypes. There was some concern at English Electric about the somewhat variable nature of government support for aircraft development, especially supersonic aircraft, and they thought it wise not to advertise the fact that these operational prototypes would be practically new aircraft. To maintain a low profile, they simply designated them P1Bs. Ministry specifications went through multiple reissues until the aircraft had been transformed from a simple, low supersonic cannon-armed day fighter to a day and night fighter armed with rockets, guided missiles and cannon, and capable of Mach 2 speeds. Keeping a low profile proved to be a wise decision. Had they not done so, it's probable that the Lightning would never have escaped the looming cutbacks of 1957. Ironically, the Minister of Supply was Duncan Sands, who went on to become Minister of Defence. And he had a very clear idea of the future of manned fighters.
The V-1 flying bomb attack was expected, and we were put down on Dungeness specifically to counter that attack. Well, the Tempest was very good at it and soon started scoring highly. Duncan Sands appeared on the scene as an advisor to Prime Minister Churchill. He was tasked with assessing the defences against the flying bomb, making recommendations. He appeared on our airfield one day, and as the chap in charge of flying, I was tasked with showing him round. I told him what we were doing, explained how we were doing it, and he didn't sound terribly enthusiastic. He sounded even less enthusiastic when one of my chaps shot down a V-1 very close to us, and when we picked ourselves out of the ditch and dusted the dust off ourselves, he got up and he said, looked at his watch and he said, well, I think I've seen all I need to see. It's time I went. And then there was a short pause, and he said, you know, you chaps are all wasting your time. All of this will be done with rockets in the future. That was in 1944. In 1957, when we were in the process of honing this new supersonic Lightning fighter into a potent weapon for the Royal Air Force, and it was going extremely well. We were right in the beginning of the test program on the Lightning itself. We were flying at Mach 2. We were finding the aeroplane completely controllable. We were just getting into the beginnings of setting up and putting into full working order the complicated radar and weapon system, when the Defence White Paper came out, known ever since as the Sands White Paper, or the Sandstorm, which defined, as far as we could read it, we couldn't believe it, that after the Lightning there would be no supersonic replacement aircraft for the Royal Air Force, and that all defence of the UK would be carried out by missiles in the future. So over 10 years he at least hadn't changed his policy.
Prior to the issue of the paper, officials quite correctly had been reassessing defence expenditure and the composition of the armed services and their equipment in the light of new technical and operational developments and, of course, Britain's changing role in the world. Unfortunately, the paper carried these thoughts to extremes, and a number of fighter projects and the supersonic bomber were cancelled. The emphasis shifted greatly to the nuclear deterrent and guided missiles. For the Lightning, paragraphs 17 and 62 are relevant, if I can just quote quickly from them. Paragraph 17 says, amongst other things, the defence of the bomber airfields is therefore an essential part of the deterrent and is a feasible task. A manned fighter force, smaller than at present, but adequate for this limited purpose, will be maintained and will progressively be equipped with air-to-air guided missiles. Fighter aircraft will, in due course, be replaced by a ground-to-air guided missile system. That, of course, is carrying a view to extreme. Paragraph 62 says, in view of the good progress already made, the government have come to the conclusion that the RAF are unlikely to have a requirement for fighter aircraft of types more advanced than the supersonic P-1, and work on such projects will stop. Thus, the Lightning survived. Just. But our plans for extending its range and developing its operational effectiveness still further were squashed.
The government's determination to pursue a missile-only defence of the UK cast a shadow over the future developments of the Lightning. Almost as a gesture of defiance, the P-1B went supersonic on the exact day that Sands presented his white paper. The Farnborough air display of 1958 reflected the mood of the times.
The 1958 exhibition and display of the Society of British Aircraft Constructors, or simply Farnborough. Missiles, radar, aircraft, the whole parade of the power and the utility of aviation. The dawn of the space age and of the jet era. The real emergence of the helicopters. All these things reflected in the pageant of the Farnborough skies. First, the current armament of the Royal Air Force, the Javelin all-weather fighters, and a cloud of hunters. Representatives of the squadrons of Great V bombers, a Victor, a Vulcan, and a Valiant. And those maids of much work, the cameras. Lightning, the P-1's was, now in full production, last, they say, of the manned fighters. It can do twice the speed of sound and shows off its reheat with a burst of power.
English Electric continued to weave their way through the vagaries of government policy and saw their commitment to the Lightning project rewarded when the Lightning F1 entered service with No. 74 Squadron in June of 1960. The Royal Air Force was now truly supersonic. The F1 was the operational version of the P-1B. Although it was, in principle, an all-weather fighter, the F-1 didn't have this capability in practice. Its basic navigation system, low endurance, and missiles designed to be effective in a stern chase scenario did not guarantee being able to down a target and recover to base on a stormy night. On a positive note, however, the RAF had a fighter that could probably outclimb any other aircraft in the world. The Lightning's role was relatively straightforward. It was to intercept high-flying targets relying on its fast reaction time, very high rate of climb, and phenomenal acceleration to do the job.
Call data, primary stud 6, secondary 9, mission number 74, scramble, 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 acknowledge. you're clear takeoff. The barrier's up, the other shoot hook goes up, and the service wind is from the south at 5 knots.
To complete the role of interceptor, the Lightning was fitted with a Ferranti air-pass fire-control radar and two 30mm cannon. Later Marks would be armed with 44 spin-stabilised 2-inch rockets in a special fuselage pack. Its principal armament, however, was initially 2 underwing Firestreak and later 2 Red-Top air-to-air missiles. Later variants for export would be capable of carrying some 400 different combinations of stores, which could include Matra rocket launchers carrying a total of 72 Sneb rockets, and up to 6 1,000-pound bombs. This range of stores options would give the Lightning a ground attack capability which was essential if the aircraft stood any chance of succeeding in the highly competitive but lucrative export market. But reaching this point had been an uphill struggle. The legacy of Sand's white paper frustrated English Electric's efforts to develop the fighting capabilities of the Lightning to the full.
The Lightning development was delayed, interfered with and finally stopped by lack of government support when it was needed. In projects of this nature, it's impossible for one company to carry out all the developments that are required to obtain the full value out of all the research and development that's gone into it without a backing from one positive customer. Generally speaking, a military aeroplane, you expect your own government to positively back the project. When the Lightning had demonstrated its extreme capability and its potential for further development, we all expected that positive decisions would be taken to take on the developments for the aircraft in the Royal Air Force, which in turn would make it attractive to overseas buyers and export. This didn't happen. What in fact did happen was a series of the most inexplicable cock-ups, which one doesn't understand to this day. But the aeroplane was first designed in accordance with requirements in the usual way, and a specification issued, and it called for the weapon system to be a combined system of state-of-the-art missiles, air-to-air missiles, and the latest development of the 30mm Aden cannon. And the Mark I and Mark II Lightnings were built in this way. Then when the Mark III Lightning was about to be put into production with increased power in the engines and improvements in the radar system, the government contract required that the guns were no longer needed and that these would be designed out of the aeroplane. And we were very surprised about this because this was a very big and expensive aeroplane just to be armed by only 2 missiles. However, we did what we were told, and we put this aeroplane into production with just missiles. About 30 aeroplanes down the production line, the government came on to us and said, yes, but we think we would now like to have guns put back into the Mark III Lightning. And we will have the remainder of the production run of the Mark III Lightning equipped with guns as well as missiles. And we thought, well, there goes a good waste of a very large quantity of taxpayers' money, but we did what we were told. And then we were surprised to learn that, not satisfied with that, they wanted to make the whole run of the Mark IIIs, 30 of which had already been built, up to the new standard. So they then flew one by one their first 30 Mark III Lightnings back to the factory to have the front end pulled apart and guns and ammunition bays put back in, until the Air Force finally got a complete series of Mark IIIs with guns.
By the mid-60s, it began to dawn on the government that the age of the manned fighter was here to stay. Although the government were still dragging their heels on extending the Lightning's role, the aircraft was an unmitigated success for the squadrons. B's view of the aircraft was soon to be mirrored by operational pilots.
The Lightning was, from the pilot's point of view, an exceptional design. I think I would describe flying the Lightning as being extremely satisfying because it was a Vice's aeroplane. Despite its enormous power and very high performance, it would behave absolutely predictably. It had very precise controls, just like handling a really good sports or racing car. So it was satisfying from that point of view. And it had all this enormous performance. If we ignore the P-1 research aeroplane, and go to the P-1B Lightning first prototype, which had a vast increase in performance. We started in 1957 with that aeroplane, weighing 29,000 pounds, and in full reheat it had 30,000 pounds of thrust. So that it had a more than 1-to-1 power-to-weight ratio, which in simple terms meant that if you stood it on its tail it would go straight up for a limited distance, but it was almost like a rocket. Now, this was most apparent to the pilot right from the start. One Royal Air Force pilot, first time he flew a Lightning, was asked to describe the sensation afterwards, and he said, "Superb. I was with it all the way until I let the brakes off."
For B, there were moments of pure enjoyment amongst the years of flight testing and evaluation.
Well, there are so many things that you could enjoy, and if you were at 30,000 feet on a clear day and you were fed up with doing a gentle cruise back to base, you could roll it inverted, pull it through 45 degrees of a dive at 0.9 Mach number, and have to watch out very carefully that you didn't go supersonic because you'd be pointing towards the land, and go through 25 of those 30,000 feet in about 1 minute and roll out low level. And it was all very exhilarating stuff, very enjoyable.
The winter of 1965 called upon the Lightning to perform a new role, to police West German airspace under a tri-national agreement that included France and America. A young wing commander, Joseph Gilbert, took 92 Squadron from Leconfield to form part of NATO's 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force.
I took command of number 92 Squadron, Lightnings of course, at Leconfield in Yorkshire in the early 1960s. And the air defence task in the United Kingdom was comparatively simple. The United Kingdom is surrounded by sea. The air defence picture was relatively clear. It was easy to identify aircraft, and it wasn't likely that we'd get confused as to what was what. But when we took the aircraft to Germany, it was quite different. And it was different because we had to integrate into a much more complex air defence structure, and by the way, with 6 different nations' aircraft as well. And so the air defence picture was much more confused, and it demanded more of the ground controllers on the ground, and of course the pilots in the air. And in addition to that, we had to deploy the aircraft forward. My squadron was based at Geilenkirchen on the Dutch border, but if we were to do our interception task, we had to go forward to Gütersloh, and that meant deploying 3 or 4 aircraft forward, which split the squadron and made life rather difficult. But of course it enabled us to do our task properly, which was to get to the border extremely quickly in case there were any incursions. So life was different, it was different, but the aircraft did the task very well, so we were quite happy about that. For our battle flight task, we had to intercept anything that came close to or strayed over the border. And for that purpose we had an air defence interception zone, which was our side of the border. And we would aim to intercept anything that came into there that wasn't properly flight planned and checked through the radar system. Now, we had rules of engagement. If I could just remind that the rules of engagement, perhaps for the other side, were a little bit more open. I mean, aircraft were shot down from our side that did stray over, notably much later the civilian airliner in the Far East. But our rules of engagement were fairly strict, and we had to see any aircraft that we intercepted and identify it as not being a friendly aircraft. And then that aircraft had to commit what was termed a hostile act. So it actually had to, in a sense, be in the business of starting a war before we could shoot at it. And even then, we would need permission from the ground to do so. So the rules of engagement were very strict, and we were not about to start World War III.
In contrast, the battle for export sales wasn't going well. English Electric were trying to sell the Lightning to Germany, and they weren't winning any orders.
No, there was a very good reason for that. It wasn't permitted to. When we were well in the development of the Lightning, and we could see that it was going to meet all its performance requirements, the Royal Air Force were going to get an aeroplane of superb controllability, world-beating performance, but with a weapon system that needed further development. We were expecting that development to start. We found it was being backpedaled by the authorities. We weren't getting a go-ahead to develop it. And then we turned our attention with this highly potential aeroplane to the European market. This was just at the time when the European air forces were developing after the war and wanting to go fully supersonic. The first one was going to be the Germans. Whoever got into Germany was going to lead all the other nations. We could see that. And so we started offering proposals for developments of the Lightning to the German government, West German government. And we got no responses. And after a few weeks and months, with our representatives in Bonn, they came back saying that we're actually not talking to the right people. There's something very strange going on. The Americans are making a lot of headway, but we're not getting through to the right people. And our company made investigations in whatever levels were necessary in London, and came back with the astonishing information that there was a government official in Bonn, in Germany, actively advising the German government that they should not consider the Lightning as it was not suitable for their requirement. We then carried out further investigation to identify who this person was, and we found that it was in fact a gentleman who later became a junior minister. But against this opposition, of course, the Germans dropped the idea of the Lightning.
Not all news on the export front was bleak. The British Aircraft Corporation, which had absorbed English Electric, was winning important contracts for BAC and Britain.
Before I retired, we had 5 times won the largest single export contract ever achieved by any British company. I think 4 of those were in Saudi Arabia, which proceeded by phases, and the other important one, of course, was the Jaguar contract with India. Had the sentence in the 1957 White Paper been taken to its conclusion, namely that there would be no supersonic fighters after the paper, and had we not just scraped through with the Lightning, a very large number of very profitable export contracts involving not just English Electric, British Aerospace, and so on. But something like 1,000 or more other British companies.
Tanker Kilo from Charlie 7, approaching from astern. Roger, Charlie 7, nuclear astern, starboard horizon.
The defence politics of the early 60s that had haunted the Lightning were starting to evaporate.
Charlie 7, ready for contact, starboard horizon.
The problem of the aircraft's lack of endurance was now firmly back on the agenda. Although there were government moves afoot to resolve the Lightning's limited range, they went about it in a way that had characterised their misguided understanding of the whole project right from the start.
Charlie 7, contact.
We knew from the Mark II it had been designed to defend only the V1 bases in the northeast of England, that the radius of action would be so limited that we would not be able to sell the aeroplane abroad. And we said that, well, no matter what the Air Force requirement is, we need to double the internal fuel capacity if we're going to make this an export success. The official attitude to that was that the Air Force has no requirement. At about the end of this cock-up that I've just described about the guns, the Air Ministry got onto us and said, we would now like the increased fuel capacity put into the Mark III series of Lightnings, and we will now call it the Mark VI. And a certain number of the Mark VIs, with the new increased fuel capacity, will have guns put into the front of the increased capacity long-range tank. This was all at great cost to the taxpayer once again. We did this, and this provided the basis for the increased fuel which we knew we were going to need for export. On the basis of that, the company then provided a whole series of developments to the Lightning to carry under-wing stores, bombs and rockets, reconnaissance cameras, and various other improvements to the aeroplane, including, of course, the new fuel system. This was offered to the Saudi Arabians, and it became the basis of what's now known as the Al Yamamah contract of the defence of Saudi Arabia, air defence of Saudi Arabia, based initially on the Lightning, and now running, of course, with the Tornado. None of this would have ever happened if we hadn't funded these developments ourselves.
1966 saw BAC winning an export contract named Magic Palm for 35 Mark 53s, which were based on the F6. The deal was worth £89 million. The whole operation was a massive success, although there were serviceability problems.
Our initial commitment was simply the supply of aircraft. We were not responsible for the servicing of the aircraft. That was handled by another company.
When we undertook to supply the Saudi Arabian Air Force with a force of Lightnings, this was going to take them from a subsonic Air Force to a supersonic Air Force in one step. It had been done before, but not in as basic a desert country as Saudi Arabia, with lack of support facilities. In UK or in America or in France, there was in-depth support technology available. In Saudi Arabia, we would have to import all our support from UK to Saudi Arabia, right the way down, in fact, as we found eventually, to language training for people we employed out there. And it was a big task. It was underestimated in the first instance. We as the suppliers supplied the aeroplanes and the backup technical equipment. The administration out there and on-the-ground training, other than flying training, was put in the hands of another company who very much underestimated the task. Within a few years, it did get very difficult, and this was quickly reflected in low serviceability with the aircraft.
Frankly, the servicing was not up to the standards which we would have wished. And I have I had personal experience of that.
Keeping the aeroplanes in the air became a major problem. This was sorted out by putting by, if you like, strengthening the team, the support activity out there from the UK with a lot of people who were well experienced in the aeroplane.
Once the Saudis had let us, with the RAF monitoring team, take over responsibility for the operation, the whole operation, and provide proper servicing facilities, properly trained people and so on, then the operation very rapidly improved and became entirely successful.
We then had the Lightnings operating as effectively with about the same number of man-hours per flying hour as the Royal Air Force did in this country. So the problems were partly administrative and partly environmental, and they were both got right.
RAF Lynham, the home of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules in Britain. Not perhaps an obvious connection with the Lightning, but on the 22nd of July 1966 a bizarre incident occurred that was to go down in Lightning history. A Lightning maintenance unit was based at Lynham in the mid-60s, and one particular aircraft was proving a problem. Every time the pilot opened the throttle and released the brakes, the instruments would simply stop working. It was a recurrent and baffling fault.
We had a whole lot of switches put into the cockpit for the pilot to switch in and out and attempt to find which part of the circuit was causing the trouble. So when I phoned the pilot to come and do another check, he said that he was sorry, but he couldn't make it the next day, nor could he get across for a whole week. Now, I, as commanding officer of the unit, was a little bit upset that I was going to have to wait a whole week for this next air test. And the test pilot suggested to me that because I was a pilot trained, that I might like to do the check myself. He explained what I should do, that I should have the aircraft towed out to the runway, to a lazy runway not in use, to brief air traffic control what I was going to do, have radio communication with a Land Rover by the side of the aircraft telling when I was going to do each check. And the idea was that I would open the throttles to about 90% RPM, let the brakes off, throttle back and see what instruments had changed and what more switching I could do before I did the next check. That was when everything went wrong for me, when I proceeded to do the next check. I opened the throttles on this third check, and I must have pushed them just a little bit too far, and then there was this almighty burst of reheat thrust added to the takeoff thrust of the engines, which really just shot me forward like a big kick in the pants. Now, that obviously gave me the shock of my life, that really. How the devil to get it out, to reheat and stop the thing. But then, before I could think clearly, there in front of me, crossing the runway, was a Bowser and trailer full of fuel, going from right to left in front of me, across the runway that I was on. It was on its way to refuel Britannia aircraft. And that took 2 or 3 seconds, perhaps shorter time than that, from my thinking time to do anything about this unleashed power of this lightning. And I did manage to miss that Bowser. I didn't have to steer past it, because you can't start steering on a runway with a thrust like that. It's like a rocket. It's one direction only, down the runway. And I missed that Bowser perhaps 30 or 40 feet, thank goodness. But then the next event that really took my attention away, just in front of me, again crossing my path from left to right this time, a Comet aircraft was just taking off on the main duty runway. And the runway I was on was a lazy runway crossing that duty runway. So there again I had those horrible thoughts of hitting an aircraft on the main runway, but that just took those another 1 or 2 seconds away from my thinking time. But by that time I had really gathered just too much flying speed on the ground, that is 100 knots, 110 knots, I'm guessing now what that speed was. But then the next thought was, I can't stop it now. There's no way of stopping it. If I try and keep it on the ground, crash it at the end of the runway, I will simply go into a village ahead of me, Bradenstoke village, and I obviously didn't want to do that. That was going to cause too much havoc, I thought. So the only cause for me was to lift the thing off the ground, really, when I had no runway left. Thankfully, that aircraft was trimmed for flight from the previous attempt to fly it by the qualified test pilot. So all I had to do was ease the stake back, and it just took off beautifully in reheat.
Taffy was suddenly airborne. No parachute and no canopy, although he had strapped himself in. His first thoughts were to get out of reheat and then land the beast. He throttled back and started a circuit. He made 2 attempts to land, but couldn't get the speed or approach right. For the 3rd attempt, he thought he'd got everything right. Taffy committed himself for a landing. Taffy Holden remarkably had lived to tell the tale. But this episode also showed off the superb handling qualities of the Lightning. The Lightning's manoeuvrability and awesome power attracted thousands to the Farnborough air displays, eager to see Britain's supersonic fighter.
The Lightning introduced a new era in display flying because of this enormous amount of surplus power it had. All Lightning's displays used to begin with this tremendous blast of reheat takeoff, and then instead of just climbing away steadily into the distance before turning around and coming back and starting an aerobatic display, the Lightnings would just be just off the end of the airfield, rotated into the vertical, and they go straight up in a vertical climb to the cloud base. And when you saw 12 airplanes do this in line of stern formation, with all the thunder and roar that went with it, it was really impressive.
Lightnings had written a very important and comprehensive chapter in the history of British fighters, but it was now time for some of the early aircraft to be taken out of service. It fell to Joseph Gilbert to apply the official signature.
Much later in life, I was still flying to an extent, but not flying the Lightning daily. I found myself as Assistant Chief of Air Staff. And I didn't know this when I took over the job, but one of the comparatively minor tasks to do was to sign off an aircraft out of service when the Royal Air Force didn't need to fly it operationally. And one day the Air Commodore who worked for me came in with a full long list of the Lightning 2 and 2As that had to be written off. And that meant they could be used for other purposes, for firefighting practice or for whatever, or even put on the gates of stations. And he asked me to sign them off, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And he was amazed and said, why? And I told him why, and I said, I just can't sign off these aircraft, I can't do it. And he said, well, what am I to do? Because you have to sign it. And I said, you've got somebody else to sign it. So he took the sheet up to the floor above me where the Vice Chief of Air Staff was sitting, and he in fact signed it. But before he signed it, he said to me, what the hell are you playing at down there? Why do I have to sign this? And I told him, and he then signed without any qualm at all. He saw my point of view.
It's a mark of all great fighter aircraft that they win the affection and allegiance of those that fly them. For the Lightning pilot, nothing else could ever quite match up to the experience of flying it. Its startling turn of speed, responsive handling and maneuverability made it supremely a pilot's aircraft. 15 tons of screaming aluminium, some called it. The story of the Lightning is a story about people. The small design team that battled on in the face of potentially disastrous changes in government policy. The flight test team with their courage and professionalism. Together, their vision of excellence and determination to achieve it took Britain into the supersonic age with an aircraft that the nation could be proud of. The Lightning was the spearhead product that has helped Britain go on to win some of the largest export contracts in her history, creating thousands of jobs in the process. It is an epic story of enterprise and the will to succeed. The aircraft holds a unique place in the history of British aviation, for it is the last British fighter.